Whoops.
Welcome, friends. It is so beautiful to see all your faces here. My name is Frances Kramer. I'm the Director of Education at Pendle Hill. Welcome, friends. It is so beautiful. Thanks for your patience as we navigate this miraculous technology that allows us to talk to you across space and also across time as this is being recorded. I'm joining you from Lenni Lenape land on what is now known as Philadelphia. Since 1930, Pendle Hill has been an experiment in spiritual learning community. It is a great joy to see many of our leaders, our alumni, and also to those who are new tonight, who are joining us at Pendle Hill for the first time. One of our experiments is our First Monday lecture series, which invites friends near and far to join us in learning together. We're especially grateful to the Friends Foundation for the Aging, whose support allows us to continue making our First Monday lecture series and other online offerings free to friends of all ages. I am extremely excited tonight to be welcoming Lauren Brownlee and Zenaida Peterson. Before I say more about them, I wanted to go over a few brief tech aspects. I'm joined tonight by Kat Castrong, Pendle Hill's current Quaker Voluntary Service Fellow. If you have any technical difficulties or questions, please message Kat or me, and we'll do our best to support you. You may have noticed that we are live streaming this video to our YouTube channel, Pendle Hill USA. Only those speaking will be live streamed. In the coming days, we will send out a link to the recording along with resources from tonight. I've enabled live transcription, so you are able to access closed captioning. For most of the program tonight, the chat will only be open for technical questions to Kat and myself. But throughout the program, the speakers will encourage you to write down reflections and highlights. It may be supportive at this point if you want to grab a writing utensil and something to write on, so you can jot notes down. At certain moments, the speakers will invite clarifying questions in the chat, and we will open the chat for everyone and synthesize some of the questions that are shared. So with that, I get to introduce our friends, Lauren Brownlee. Her pronouns is Friends Committee on National Legislation of CNL's newly announced Deputy General Secretary and former inaugural Associate General Secretary for Community and Culture. She helps to steward FCNL's shared anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments. Lauren joins FCNL after serving on the organization's general committee beginning in 2017 and its executive committee from 2019 to 2022. She has also served on the boards of Sandy Springs Friends School, DC Peace Teams, the National Farm Workers Ministry, the Central Committee for Friends General Conference, and the Program Committee for Quakers Uprooting Racism. Before coming to FCNL, Lauren was the upper school head at Carolina Friends School, and before that, the director of social action at Stone Ridge School of the Sacred Heart. Zenaida Peterson uses they, them pronouns and is a Black and non-binary friend, organizer, artist, and seeker. They are learning what it means to live and be kinder through nature connection, writing poems, and working for Quaker voluntary service. As the Boston coordinator and the director of equity and empowerment, they have both participated and been an associate for Nurturing Faithfulness program, and since the beginning of their Quaker journey, see their social justice and spiritual work as dependent on each other. And with that, I will pass the evening along to Zenaida and Lauren.
Thank you all so much for having us. We're excited to be here. I can speak for both of us. Yes, my name is Zenaida, and we're excited to have you on this journey this evening. I want to invite folks to drop the name of the lands that you're on, the indigenous names of the lands that you are on. This is one of those moments where we ask you to use the chat. And I think if it hasn't happened already, there will be a link to a website that will help you to figure out what that name is if you don't know it already. I want us to begin by acknowledging that there was a catastrophic attempt at ethnically cleansing indigenous folks from the so-called United States, where 70 million people were killed and those who survived were largely displaced. 7.3 million people have been displaced in Sudan, 6.1 million people in Congo, 2.1 million people in Gaza, and 200,000 in Haiti right now. Even though our global community is not the focus of our time together today, it feels important to name the impacts of racism, imperialism, and white supremacy culture that are having horrific impacts on our indigenous communities here and our neighbors abroad today. So we're going to start with a few minutes of worship. It's really nice to get to see all of these names coming in the chat. Thank you all so much. We're going to begin with a few minutes of worship. And in these minutes, try to access some stillness in your body and notice your breath. In just a few minutes, there will be a little bit of guided worship where I'll ask you some queries. Where are you? In what seat? In what room? On what street? With which trees and plants nearby? What is the nearest body of water? In what city or town are you? In what state? In what country? In what hemisphere? On what planet? Which astral bodies are our closest neighbors? In what galaxy? In what universe? I want to invite you to open your eyes if they're closed and acknowledge 5 things that you see. What are 4 things that you feel? Maybe your body on a chair, something on your clothing, something soft nearby. What are 3 things that you hear? What are 2 things that you smell? And what's 1 thing that you taste? Whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I also appreciate this note in the chat that there is ongoing ethnic cleansing in the United States, and I do think that is important to honor as well here in so many places. And it's why this work is so important, that we all figure out our way to be a part of the solution. I want to say I am so thrilled that there are so many of us who are interested in this topic, that this is work that Zenaida and I certainly believe is really important to Quaker communities, and that Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism believes is so important for Quaker communities to be investing in and doing the work of, and seeing this many people who are showing up makes a difference, because it is a sign of putting your time into what matters. So I want to say thank you for that. And I also, I'm just going to introduce the fact that today we are talking about patterns of racism that we have observed and experienced within the Religious Society of Friends, and that we understand are not unique to the Religious Society of Friends, but are part of the society and the world that we live in. And so we are trying to disrupt those patterns within the Religious Society of Friends. And we believe that we have what it takes to do that. We know that we have, in many, many places within the Religious Society of Friends, the will to do that. And what we're trying to also build up is the skill. And hopefully, as more of us are skillful, we can also increase that circle of people who have the will to do it as well. So as we are in this worshipful space that Zenaida has created, I also want to invite us to take a moment to think about what are the feelings that come up when we reflect on racism within the Religious Society of Friends. And you don't need to write it anywhere. You don't need to do anything with that information at this time, but just take a moment to hold those feelings that come up when you think about racism within the Religious Society of Friends, within Quaker communities of all kinds. Thank you. We believe that it's important that we start our time together with that acknowledgement of how important it is for us to be present and for us to feel this work that we're doing in an embodied way from that place of presence, accessing all of our feelings, because that is what will empower us to transform. Zenaida and I are on the steering committee for the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, which is a collaboration between the American Friends Service Committee, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Friends General Conference, Pendle Hill, the Friends Committee on Friends Council on Education, and Quaker Voluntary Service. This was a group that was first imagined in 2018 by Vanessa July and Lucy Duncan. And through this vision, there is now this month starting a second iteration of a 9-month cohort program that focuses, and the cohort program has racial parity within it between white participants and participants of color, for folks in Quaker communities to be able to learn how to resist patterns of racism in our own lives and in our communities, how we can be transformative presences by learning more about ourselves, thinking deeply about and with our communities, and then being places of action. I would like to read the mission statement for the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism. It states that we bring together a community of practice of racial justice change makers to support one another in working within our Religious Society of Friends. These racial justice practitioners model and move toward the vision through embodied spiritual practice and mindful action within and beyond Quaker communities. The community of practice builds trusting relationships with one another, collectively names and develops strategies to dismantle white supremacy and foster root-level change, meaningful change rather than performative change, and builds skills toward change strategies, actively experimenting with them and bringing those learnings from those actions back to the group. That is what we're doing in the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism. I got involved in Quaker, as Frances said. Frances and I were on the program committee together when I was at Carolina Friends School. And I am someone who has done I have associated a spirituality to my anti-racism work since I was a student at Sidwell Friends School and then an educator at Sidwell Friends School, through my yearly meeting, Baltimore yearly meeting, and work in my monthly meeting at Bethesda Friends meeting. So this is work that I've carried in a variety of ways. So I was thrilled to support the work when I was at Carolina Friends School. And then when I came to FCNL, was right as FCNL was being invited to be a member organization of the cohort. So I was thrilled to join the steering committee at that time. Zenaida, what about you? How did you get involved in Quaker?
Well, I've been working for Quaker Voluntary Service since 2016, and I've been the Director of Equity and Empowerment since 2020, I believe, 2019 maybe. Um, something over like I might be wrong about those dates. But I first heard about Quakers collaborating to uproot racism in my work with QBS and QBS alumni, Linnea, who has participated on the committee, invited me to join, and yeah, I really enjoyed being able to do this work across many organizations, many Quaker organizations. Yeah. So I wanted to just like get on the same page about the definition of racism, because I think that people are often confused about what that means. Racism is a system of advantage based on race. And often people don't allow themselves to think critically about their internalized racism, because there's a narrative or a common belief that racism is just like the acts of prejudice that get manifested in our culture. And yeah, just because I am not going to act on prejudices that I was socialized with doesn't mean that I have not internalized racism, because it's in our culture and it's everywhere. And so if you were raised in the United States or in the West, I can say with confidence that the kinds of racism that we're talking about here, that show up within the Religious Society of Friends in the West in particular and in the United States, that there is some things here for us to all think about. And hopefully, because you willingly came to this call, you know that there's something worth thinking about and talking about. I'm so excited to do that with you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the development of this resource. While planning for the upcoming Quaker, that's the acronym, Quakers Collaborating to Uproot Racism Quaker cohort, news broke out about a white woman at a Quaker organization pretending to be a person of color and seeing the response of the wider Quaker world. Many of us were challenged by that, and Lauren and I, with the help of LJ Boswell of NEYM, New England Yearly Meeting, put together these patterns that we see among friends and are going to be working with today, and we're going to be looking at together. So like Frances mentioned in my initial bio, I was an associate with the last Nurturing Faithfulness program led by Marcel Martin, and it was my second time participating. Some people on this call were some of my cohort members. Each time that I participated in that program, there were patterns of racism that showed up in our time together. And being able to have 9 months to deepen relationship and trust made it more possible for us to have progress, more progress than I've ever seen or experienced after an instance of harm within the Religious Society of Friends. And that's given me a lot of hope. And it was made possible because we had time for affinity groups and all together to listen and to be accountable to each other. And while working with Lauren on this document that we're going to be spending time with today, I was also writing the remonstrance, which has maybe made it to some of your meetings. But if not, we're going to send it out afterwards. But yeah, that experience helped me to see that Quaker bodies can transform, that we can be more faithful and more connected after an instance of harm if we resist the dominant culture's instinct to just forget about it and move on. So we hope that folks will use this document as a guide for further conversations and to stay in relationship.
Thank you. So now we are going to go through the document. Thank you, Francis, for having put the PDF version. We're going to go through in some slides and not talk through every word of it because you will have access to the guide itself, but to talk about a little bit of what's underneath each of the patterns that we have seen. And we're going to go through and then give you a little bit of time to reflect individually, and then we'll have some small group reflection time so that people can really talk about how they've seen these patterns show up of both racial wounding and racial justice. And so if we could get the slides up. Thank you. Go to the conflict avoidance slide, please. Thank you. I will just give people a moment to take a look at these, a breath to take a look at these explanations and examples of conflict avoidance among friends, but I imagine that many friends have their own examples of this. I think it's one of the things that I hear joked most often about with Quakers is how much we have in common often that people feel a part of Quaker culture is conflict avoidance. And what I and we are hoping that people can see is that there are some alternatives to this. But I think one of the ways that conflict avoidance can look like is when people think about plain speaking. And plain speaking is a part of Quaker culture that people really believe in for good reason, that it is speaking with integrity. And my friend Pierce, who I saw on the call, likes to talk so often about the importance of speaking with both truth and love. And I think sometimes plain speaking can feel like it is sharing truth without always also holding on to the love aspect of our relationships. And that when that happens, that people can be hurt or offended by the words of others. And they're not always wrong words. Sometimes someone is speaking, even sometimes an important truth. And when they are sharing that in a way that does not take into account, especially when they are someone who has a lot of positional power, not taking into account the needs of the community, the care for the community as they are sharing. And then people, especially people, again, with less social or positional power, speak up and say, the way that you said that was harmful to me. That the community can have a hard time holding that because people feel like, well, that person has the right to speak their truth, and that can be sometimes the end of it. And in large part, that is often a symptom of people not wanting to engage in the conflict, of having to address the hurt that has happened in those moments, and not wanting to upset the person who is the plain speaker, so to speak, in that situation. Again, often when that person is the person with more power, social or positional power, that people are afraid of speaking up about that. If we look at the interventions on the next slide, I think a lot of what this boils down to is a quote that I have turned to a lot recently, that I was first introduced to in Kazu Haga's book, Healing Resistance. And it is a quote from Matidoma Somé that is, "Conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself to deepen." So thinking about ways that we can lean into conflict as being a way to get to know our community better, to know how to care for each other better when we are able to hold it in ways that are healthy and healing, listening to people's different sides of things, not feeling like we need to pick a right and a wrong, but moving often at the speed of trust toward learning about the needs of our community and being responsive to them. And so thinking about how we can have that growth mindset when conflict occurs, and thinking specifically about how we can have processes in place ahead of time, so that people know when harm happens, what they can do to address it. People have some practice in trying to address harm or conflict, have tools at the ready that the whole community is well practiced in. So that then when the harm, when the hurt does happen, the whole community is ready to engage in that healing, and it doesn't feel shameful, but is part of everyone's growth. Next slide, please.
Okay, Guardians of the Status Quo. My phone went everything sideways for me, but that's okay. I wanted to highlight a couple of these. The third little arrow says the erasure and color blindness, believing that friends can ignore our racist socialization and difference, which doesn't acknowledge the experience of marginalized friends' experience in community, and also an unacknowledged power dynamics, which Lauren started to touch on. So a lot of these are in some ways connected and the stories are connected, but thinking that everyone has the same amount of power within Quakerism, rather than acknowledging the dynamics that impact how much people feel empowered to speak their truth and or be witnessed in their truth. Yeah, I think that having a spiritual community where power isn't top down can be idealistic if we are not honest with ourselves about how race shows up in our meetings and its impacts on having meetings not just be welcoming, but places where people experience belonging and empowered to participate fully. If we visualize a Venn diagram of our Quaker culture and cultures of whiteness, doing the collective work to disrupt patterns of racism would look like teasing out what in the overlapping space doesn't need to be Quaker culture, just because we have done it for a long time. You can go to the next one, the next slide. So these are some of our interventions. And I want to uplift the very first one, which is being willing to be changed, understanding that transformation is the Quaker tradition. Our ancestors were led by the spirit, not fear, and certainly not fear of change. Yeah, I think there's a lot of stories of that when we look to early friends. I'm going to pass it back over to Lauren.
Thank you. We have slide. Denying that oppression exists within Quaker communities. Again, I'm just going to give people a minute to read through this one. And I think what this one can often boil down to is a deep down belief that because of some really important moments of Quaker history, where Quakers got it right, that then Quakers can't get it wrong, or that we have to do things in exactly the ways that Quakers have done them before, because that has worked for us for all of these years. And one example that I wanted to share on this one is, I think back, especially in some of our moments of thinking in our communities about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think often there were aspects of that were tricky in a lot of Quaker communities, about how to show up in that moment. And I think often when people were thinking about what had happened before in the ways that Quakers showed up, it was harder for friends to embrace new ways of being. And one example of that is when there were moments when friends of color in particular were saying, we really need to see a statement from our meetings about this, and meetings would sometimes get lost in the process of what needed to happen for that to occur. Or the same, I think, sometimes when there is something, I've heard from several meetings about people using the N-word in worship, and people not knowing how to respond to that because it's worship. And so no one wants to interject because it feels like people have such reverence for messages that people share, and not always being able to put first the people who might be harmed in that moment because of that sense of how to hold various Quaker spaces or processes. And so then if we go to the interventions, I think the interventions invite us to be open to doing things in some new ways, especially listening to the voices of people of color in those moments, of people most directly impacted by the different issues that we are trying to address. And following their lead can be an important aspect of racial justice in this way. I wish I had written this down ahead of time, but I was reading recently the December French Journal and the article in that about the yearly meeting that has the new committee that helps them to be nimble, so that not everything has to go through the whole meeting. And I love that example of an experiment in how to try things a different way with those same core Quaker principles, and yet being flexible about the how of how we live it out, and trusting each other to be able to be open to continuing revelation as we live into our new truths. Next slide.
Performativity. So I want to uplift the second, I'll give folks a second to read it and then uplift the second. So the second little arrow says wanting to be a good Quaker and being attached to the image of that. Good Quakers dress a certain way, drive a certain car, give message in a certain formula in meeting. And I think I wanted to uplift that one because I think that that's something I imagine that most of us can easily come up with stories or conversations that are attached to that level of performativity. There are people who we think of in our lives who are good Quakers, who we are like who maybe we are aspiring into to being more like, when we think about and you can go to the interventions that I think that like being faithful and being in integrity is like moving from where we are led. And again, like looking towards our looking towards early friends, and we're not actually just trying to dress like them, but we are trying to embody the spirit of transformation that they had, and that was being bold, moving without fear, and embodying Quaker ways of being that are like rooted in truth and experimentation. So we're trying to let go of control and status or answers, and focusing on building relationship and seeking truth. You can go to the next slide.
And finally, in attention to right relationship with time. We go to the next slide. And I will name with this one. It took us some discernment to get to that title for this pattern, because it can both be that, as I referenced earlier, that we can get slowed down by process and not move sometimes at the speed of light that we are seeking. And it can go the other way, that we can miss the speed of light because we are trying to move quickly toward the deadline, or getting through all of the business that we have, and cannot slow down enough to listen to some of the important messages. And then I'll just highlight this last one too, of that perfectionism can be an element of that. And we know that sometimes in lists of characteristics of white supremacy culture, that perfectionism is named as something to be paying attention to, the sense of one right way as well. And that when we get stuck in, I need to get through every single item on this agenda, that sometimes that does not allow us to then move at the speed of light and trust. And then if we go, and my example that I wanted to share for this one is really that sense of when something is shared in particularly meeting for worship with attention to business, and there's something shared about pain that someone is experiencing, harm that has happened, an idea that would strengthen community but was not on the agenda, and people say, we don't have time to talk about that now, when sometimes that's exactly the thing that the community really needs to make the time to talk about. And so then if we go to interventions, understanding that we are operating at God's time, Spirit's time, and that there is nothing that is more important in our business than taking care of each other, and especially thinking about who in our community is speaking up in ways that we really need to be listening to. And I think, again, based on what we named in the theme for this, that what we're going for is a right relationship with time, having time justice, so to speak, that we are putting spirit, we're putting light at the center rather than our to-do lists at the center or our process at the center, which I think we are often tempted to do. We can close the slideshow for now. Oh, that's a preview of what's coming later.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I want to invite everybody to just take a real deep breath. A really, really deep one all together. And without forcing too much narrative about it, what can you allow like some presence with one feeling that you're having in your body right now? Thank you. That was a lot of information. Kat, if you wouldn't mind, or Francis, just dropping one more time the link to the original document with everything. Um, uh, I want to give folks like 3 minutes to just sit with what you've heard and read and spend some time to write down what questions you have, what was really confusing, what feels like really spicy for you, like you really didn't like hearing that, what felt like outside of your consciousness, like you really had never thought about some of these aspects of white supremacy culture that are, showing up in our meetings. Just like spend a couple of minutes, write down your feelings, your thoughts that have just been coming up. And then shortly after that, we'll have some time for folks to write in the chat some questions, some clarifying questions. And I guess for some transparency for the rest of our time together after that, we'll have some small group time where folks will be able to talk about their thoughts and feelings. So if you have a lot of burning stuff, there's going to be space for that. We'll have a little bit of big group time, and then we're going to close out. So right now, write down your thoughts and feelings. If folks can continue, finishing up those thoughts, and if it isn't available already, if we can open up the chat for folks to write questions that they have about what they read or heard that they want some clarification on. And then we'll spend a few minutes answering any clarifying questions before going into breakout groups. And I guess as we're having these questions crawl in, if you're finished writing, I'm feeling in my body some need to stretch, and I encourage you to, you know, stay present in your body. This is kind of cerebral what we're doing here. But there's a reason why we keep coming back to our breath and our feelings. Because yeah, doing this work from a place of presence is where we can experience transformation, and not just be stuck in stories. So feel free to wiggle a little.
Yeah, a couple of questions, and I received one other about the Kazuhaga quote on conflict. If Lauren will be able to share that in the chat. Maybe.
I have shared it.
Oh, it's up.
I can, and I can also put the book that I found it in as well. So it's a quote from Melodoma Somé, but I got it in Kazuhaga's book, so I can put that in as well. Seems like we may be ready to move to breakouts.
Let's go. My computer has frozen, so I don't know if I'm supposed to be introducing that or not, but I can. So what we're gonna have a bunch of small groups that our wonderful hosts are going to split us up into, and I encourage folks to think about questions that arose for you during that time. Feel free to share, where you're sensing resistance in your body, where you're experiencing excitement and creativity, what's coming up for you. And yeah, and so all of these groups are going to be named um with the one of the five attributes that we went over. And so the invitation is for you to speak about that one specifically. But if you are technologically savvy enough to enter a different group that you're feeling pretty excited about joining, you're welcome to do that too. Otherwise, yeah, talk about the one that you are in. And Lauren, I'm seeing your messages pop up. I don't know if we're able to make an extra breakout group this late because they're already made. But
is there an extra one that you want made?
I was just thinking if there are people of color who feel like it would not feel safe right now for them to be in a breakout room, that if people want to stay in the main room, then we can figure out if we need a separate affinity breakout room.
Great. So everyone's been randomly assigned. There should be about 6 to 9 people in each of the breakout rooms, there's also a BIPOC affinity room now. So you'll be automatically invited to a random room. You can choose, as Zenaida said, to go to a different one if you're really called to a different room. And if you are called to the BIPOC affinity room or want to stay here and get help being placed in a different room, you can do that too.
All right, and we will see everybody back here at 8:40, so in 14 minutes.
Welcome back, friends. It is good to see your faces again, and I hope that you had meaningful conversations. We're going to have a little bit of time right now for people to share anything that feels particularly meaningful to them coming out of that conversation. It feels important to hold care for community at the center of what we are sharing in this space. And I do really appreciate that comment that was in the chat before that said often people are not intending to be harmful. And I think that is something that we certainly know. I think especially in Quaker communities, people I think are rarely intending to be harmful. And that part of our growing together is that recognition that when our intentions and our impacts are not aligned, that we care about that, and that care can look a lot of different ways, but that there are processes for loving accountability when our intentions and our impact are unaligned. And it doesn't mean we're bad when that happens. And I think the comment about shame is also really important, that I think often we go to that shame place. And one of the things that I often say is I think because so many Quakers are so care so deeply about being a force for good in the world, that when we hear a way that we haven't been, that really hurts us to our core, and that it takes a lot of work to move beyond that sense of shame that we can feel when someone tells us that they've experienced a version of us that's different than the way that we think of ourselves and the way that we aspire to be, and that when we're in communities that are doing this racial justice work, that isn't where it ends, that we can hold each other in that pain and move through it to a place of caring for each other. And so with that, we are going to open up the space. I wonder, yes, I think the learning conversations is very good, thinking about how we're all learning and growing all the time. Zenaida, do you want to talk about the remonstrance a little bit more? And then thank you, friends, for putting some comments in the chat, because you are absolutely continued to be invited to do that, even as people are also sharing aloud. And then, oh, I see your hand first when Zenaida is done.
Yeah, I'll speak super briefly because I'd love to make time to hear from folks. Yeah, the remonstrance came out of experiencing a lot of growth in that 9-month program that ended in May. And being able to like see these little keyholes of like what our more liberated future could look like as a religious society of friends. And so this document that we've shared with today is definitely relevant for meetings, and I think was also in some ways written from the perspective of like what we see in Quaker organization. And the remonstrance is looking more specifically at what we notice in Quaker communities. And so we will send that out to everyone who registered that'll be available via email. And if you're watching this on YouTube in the future, hello future people, it'll be in the comments or in the description of the video will also be a link to the remonstrance.
Thank you.
Oh, do you want to find?
Yeah, blessings, family. I'm grateful for everyone showing up. This is really hard work. One of the things that I identified is in my grandmother's hands. One of the things that Resma points to is this unresolved trauma, intergenerational trauma that actually lives in our bodies. It lives in our nervous systems. And my concern is if we don't take the time to really understand the biology of our nervous systems, we will continue not only to harm other people, but also harm ourselves, but ultimately harm the planet. Because all of the violence that we are exchanging with each other, all of the violence that we are exchanging with each other ultimately will harm the planet and the children. And so invitation, especially as elders, which that's not to exclude the wisdom of our young people, but especially as elders, we need to hold ourselves accountable and each other accountable to really understand the biology of fear, the biology of anxiety, and the biology of supremacy, the need to feel superior. Because ultimately, my belief anyway, and I could be mistaken about this, the need to feel superior is what's destroying all relationships. And so it's imperative that we discern faithfully what healing really looks like. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you. Star.
Howdy. I was in the conflict avoidance group, and I just couldn't bring myself to say anything because in my yearly meeting, there are people that are not just avoiding conflict, they're creating conflict. They're attacking each other. They have separated into clandestine covert groups in order to figure out how to best get rid of me, the clerk of Tema Uplifting Racial Justice. And those people who are trying to be good allies and good Quaker anti-racists are at a loss for, how to intervene in that. I mean, trust has broken. You say at the speed of trust, what trust? Holding community. What community? The community is fractured. And as clerk of Tema Uplifting Racial Justice, I have been under attack since the moment I became clerk of that committee. People have tried to say I'm not a Quaker. People have tried to say that, first of all, there's scapegoating going on. People are doing racist things, causing harm to me and other members of the committee, and saying that we're responsible for their behavior. I mean, it's just ugly. What kind of intervention can you have in a situation like that? And what advice can you give to those friends in the Southern Appalachian Yearly Meeting Association for how to address this full-blown racial hysteria that we have going on?
Thank you so much, Star. And yeah, just like feeling the hurt and pain that you're speaking with. There's a question that came through in the chat. I wonder if Quaker or our facilitators have any resources for acts of accountability and calling in when harm is caused. our meetings use the terms call out culture and defense, stalls growth and education. And I think that like uh I think that we're not going to be able to heal like, you know, hundreds of years worth of socialization and culture building in a really quick, moment. And I think that it does take, I think that it does take time and investment in our relationships and in our community. Something that talk about sometimes with my fellows is that capitalism has taught us that like when something's not working out for us, we can just get a new thing. Like my shirt has a hole in it, just buy a new shirt. Your friend, said something challenging or that didn't align with your feelings, like just get a new friend, just throw it out and find something new. And that kind of thinking and behavior has caused such horrific harm to our planet and to our social skills. And I feel like we could spend a whole hour and a half talking about what accountability can look like in Quaker communities. But I think in short, I think that it takes investment. I think it takes time, and I think it takes like being present with our feelings, the things that O shared about being connected with our nervous systems, having not the person who was harmed, but people who have the space and the emotional space to be able to show up to the person who caused the harm and explain it and show up from a place of love and belief in their growth and compassion for the initial defensiveness that they have and be present for when that fades away and be there for all of that because we've sort of lost some of those social skills.
And I think we are, in the interest of time, going to have to move on to sharing some examples of how we've used the document. But Bev, I wonder if you could put your comment in the chat or question in the chat. And Zenaida, if you want to start us off.
Yeah. So one way that I've been using this document in particular with my coworkers, we have meetings every month. Quaker Voluntary Service staff spend some time with each one of these, and we've spent 2 or 3 months on just the first one, the first attribute alone, because we really want to take our time moving through it and reflecting on where do we see these aspects in our own work, in our personal Quaker communities, because we're all over the country. And yeah, I think that's what we do. We're working through it as a group, which is really wonderful.
And at FCNL, we as a staff, each department every month thinks about how they are living into or missing opportunities to live into our anti-racism, anti-bias, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion commitments. And we now include this patterns document in the reflection that we do when we're thinking about how we do or do not live into those commitments. We also, I would say, to address one of the other questions about accountability, one of the things that I have found really useful, both at Carolina Friends School and that I have now brought to Friends Committee on National Legislation, is restorative practices, and particularly doing restorative practices in a racial justice oriented way. And there are some great resources on that. There's one called Colorizing Racial Justice, or I'm sorry, Colorizing Restorative Justice which I was delighted that after that was recommended to me, that Sharon Goins from American Friends Service Committee has a whole chapter in that. And so some clear Quaker connections there. And so thinking about ways that restorative practices can help with this sense of we're all learning and growing together, and that when harm is done, that we can proactively and lovingly work toward restoration. And then also at both FCNL and Friends General Conference, there's been work to get this document of patterns and patterns of racial wounding and racial justice to our governing bodies. Both groups have shared that before our annual meetings this year of our governors to make sure that we are all reflecting on how we're showing up for those meetings as well. And in our Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism Steering Committee each month, we allow time for all of the different organizations that are present to also share back about how they've used the document in the last month, and then also how they're seeing both the patterns of wounding and justice, and ways that we can continue to learn and grow ourselves with the clear understanding that we do not have all of the answers, and are open all the time to that same sense of continuing revelation that we are asking other people to embrace.
Friends, Kat, will you or Francis bring us back up to the slideshow? We're just gonna share some like parting resources beyond some of the ones that we've already named. This list will also be in the email. And My Grandmother's Hands was named by O. It's a book I'm working through right now and find really helpful. This year, Flesh by co-author Riley. The Sum of Us, and then this last book, These Walls Between Us. I Want to Lift Up is written by a local friend in Cambridge, writing about her relationship and like growth in her anti-racism work through relationship, which might be a fun read for the Quakers of us here. Yeah. And I also, there are ways that folks can stay connected with us. I just want to uplift that Quaker Voluntary Service every Tuesday and Thursday is holding a meeting for worship with attention to Gaza, holding Gaza in the light. You can let go of this PowerPoint. Thank you. And so we'll send out the Zoom link for that as well. If folks want to join us for that as an ongoing way of staying connected.
Thank you. And before we say our very last comment about how to stay connected, is there something you wanted to say to the group before we close?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm wondering if we could use Star's example as a case study so that when you have part 2, we could have a success story around the steps that would use. So I just wanted to offer that as a possibility. We have a live situation and we have a practice or methodology. Let's see how we could support a friend who's having difficulty and help the whole meeting. That's just an idea. Thank you for asking.
Thanks,
Thank you. And Star, I do hope that you also feel like you can reach out if there is additional support that we can offer. I do just want to oh, Margaret, I see your hands up. We're at time. Is there something that really feels essential to say in this space?
Yes. from STAR's yearly meeting, and there are a number of us here from that meeting, and we would love some help with this, besides just a case study. So I just want to put that out there.
Yes, and that actually does remind me that one of the examples that I was going to use of how we have talked about using the guide is with yearly meetings, and thinking particularly about how they can be useful in a yearly meeting context. And so both, yes, specifically for your yearly meeting, but also broadly, that is something that we do see as a use for it. And I think that Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism is really eager to partner with yearly meetings to do that kind of work. So thank you for naming that. And finally, just wanted to name that the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism newsletter comes out right now about quarterly. And we are thinking we're going to ultimately try to get up to monthly about events that are happening across Quaker communities that would be open to friends across the country. And so again, in the resources that will come, you will see a way to sign up for the newsletter so that you can stay informed about the work that is happening, including spaces for worship sharing around racial justice and people sharing what they are doing, those success stories that we're all really interested in. So that providing those opportunities, those spaces is one of the things that we are planning to do in 2024. So more to come. Sign up for the newsletter so that you can learn about that. Francis, I wonder if we could put just the link to how to sign up for the newsletter.
It will definitely come in the email, and I may be able to get it into the chat as well. And I'm seeing a question also about the chart, and that chart, that link, I think it's public and to be widely shared. The document that you've created that we've been sharing here.
Great. Well, I think we thank you all and hope that we can continue that Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism can continue to partner with Quaker communities and learn with and from each other.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
Huge
you.
gratitude.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for learning and
Hi, Zenaida.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Night, good night. Let's see.